Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation. There was no audio because we were just waiting to let some more attendees trickle in. But let me introduce you all to today's event. My name is David Banks. I'm Academic Director of the King's Wargaming Network. As many of you know, the King's Wargaming Network is an association of scholars committed to understanding and improving the epistemological and pedagogical foundations of wargaming as a method, as well as understanding its impact and effects on wider society. So today's presentation is part of our annual speaker series. This is our second annual speaker series, and this is our second lecture in it. The theme for this year's speaker series is, quote, evaluating and assessing the impact of wargaming on individuals and organizations, end quote. That is to get a better sense of how wargames, if and how wargames actually impact the wider world. And we've been inviting speakers who have made important new contributions to developing thought on these issues. We have people joining us at the moment from the UK and from wider Europe. So welcome to the event. And before I introduce our speaker, let me just remind everyone that if you have questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, not the general chat. So if you put questions in the general chat, we'll probably just end up chasing you down and ask you to put it again in the Q&A function. That way they'll all be lined up very easily. And then what will happen is after the presentation, I will help moderate those questions to our speaker. So it just turns for me to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Ralf Beerens, a senior researcher at the Netherlands Institute for Public Safety, and also senior lecturer for the Institute's Master in Crisis and Public Order Management program. In September 2021, Dr. Beerens received his PhD from Lund University, Division of Risk Management and Societal Safety, where he remains affiliated as a visiting research fellow. His research is focused on disaster response exercise evaluation, and he's particularly interested in the evaluation of the operational performance of emergency response organizations, teams, or modules during exercise and crises. So he's presenting today on improving disaster response evaluations, supporting advances in disaster risk management through the enhancement of response evaluation usefulness. Now, this research has great relevance to wargaming for two reasons. First, it is often difficult to evaluate the impact of wargames in organizational or individual learning. And second, the dynamic disaster response environment in which Dr. Beerens' research takes place and the challenges it poses and faces resemble those of the challenges we face when we're trying to evaluate wargames. So overall, we think this research shows that this research shows that to gain maximum benefit from disaster response evaluations, the outcomes must be systematic, rigorous, evidence-based, and actionable. And I turn it over now to Dr. Beerens, who's going to walk us through this in detail. I remind everyone to put your Q&A into the Q&A section, and we will take it from there. So please, I turn it over to you, Dr. Beerens.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon or good evening, depends on where you are in Europe. David, thank you very much for this introduction. As mentioned, I will try to focus in this lecture about the enhancement of evaluation usefulness, and that can be used as a possible avenue to increase its impact, just what was mentioned. It is built around my PhD research that I finalized last year, and it was aimed at improving the usefulness of disaster response evaluations. But I think, and what David already mentioned, is that there are great similarities between our field of crisis management and that of wargaming. And I think one of these aspects is that both the context in which it takes place are dynamic and complex. And specific these exercises, they can play an important role, and there is a lot of similarities. But I challenge you as an audience, like David mentioned, to look at it critically. I will, of course, talk from my area of expertise, which is mainly crisis management, and I actually challenge you to make that knowledge transfer to your subject area, which might be wargaming or something else. And then it will be nice to have a conversation at the end of this lecture about the things that I told you and your area. Like I already said, is in my presentation, I want to try a mixture between scholarly rigor and practitioner relevance, and this is something that I will try to achieve by introducing and discussing some models, concepts, and processes, and I also will try to give some practical insights from my own areas of expertise. I will end this presentation with proposing some ways forward, and by doing that, I hope to open the debate for to continue on this and to make evaluations more impact. One disclaimer I always make when I'm presenting about this topic is I see evaluation as my life's work. I see great opportunities for it, and I can be very enthusiastic about it. But we should keep in mind that it's not the evaluation itself that leads to improvement, but it's the use of an evaluation that leads to improvement. So evaluation should be seen as a means to an end. And that's some disclaimer I would like to make in the beginning. So briefly, I would like to, David already mentioned it, introduce myself a little bit more. I'm working for the Netherlands Institute for Public Safety, and I'm also affiliated with Lund University as a visiting research fellow. And I'm also, like, these are my more scientific roles, and currently I'm also being trained in a more practical role or operational role, being a tactical commander for my own safety region. I will talk about the Dutch crisis management context later on a little bit, so that you understand, if I'm talking about safety regions, what that means within the Dutch system. Also, I would like to mention from these positions, and that's, I think, interesting for today's talk, is there are some spin-off from my research that I'm currently involved in. For example, I'm currently involved in a project that aims to propose a European standard for exercise evaluation. So standardization, this is one of the things that I will get back to on in the end, towards the end. That's one of my recommendations for improving this area. Another project that I'm involved in is the European project that aims for proposing an approach for evaluation of European civil protection modules and civil protection exercises. And also we are working with WHO on a monitoring and evaluation system. So there are some recent developments which I see as a spin-off of the area that I'm working on, but I think they also highlight that the area is gaining more attention and interest, and so there are some interesting times coming up on more that developmental side. On the other hand, I also think the current state that we are in as a world, we're nearing the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we also have the situation in Ukraine, which leads to conflict or to displaced persons and challenges for countries in Europe. And what you see mainly after these large-scale crises is that evaluations are taking place either during these crises or at the end, and they're providing us a lot of feedback. So there are a lot of interesting things coming up in the upcoming period, I think, regarding this topic. So it's, I think, very interesting and highly encouraging to talk about. So today, the way I structured my presentation is that after this short introduction, I will start with a little bit on the theory and the context of the subject. I will also relate it to what I said, the situation or the system in the Netherlands regarding crisis management. From there on, I will move to more the findings of my research, which I think are related to wargaming and to exercises, but also crisis, but if you want to evaluate. So these key findings I'm going to put forward, and you can place them in a broader context. And like I said, at the end, I will show some models that we can discuss, and I will open the floor for some discussions or Q&As. I hope we can have a nice interactive end, and this is not a one-way talk about an interesting topic. But first, before I'm going to more the theoretical side of it, I would like to explain why I started conducting research in this area. And since 2009, I became increasingly involved in disaster response evaluations. I was part of a large-scale European exercise, and it was basically the first exercise that used a large evaluation part. So evaluation was a very important part of that project, and I went through all the phases of evaluation. And actually, I started to wonder, like, okay, if we do these evaluations and we have a range of users that are going to use them, and how do they actually achieve their purpose? And actually, are they recognized as useful by the users? So do these evaluations really leave the response organizations better prepared to respond to future disasters as a result of conducting and following up these evaluations? I found in the beginning of my research that many issues concerning these broad topics like communications, coordination, collaboration are repeatedly reported in evaluations, and also many evaluation designs were used to evaluate either exercises and crisis. So I really started to wonder, like, okay, there is a lot of things being done and more on the practical side of it, but how can we improve these evaluations so they deliver a more useful and qualitative contribution to preparedness and response? So basically, how can we increase their impact? And my personal experiences during exercises where I saw these continuous lessons learned repeated again and again, triggered me to look into details. And I was fortunate to be supported by the Netherlands Institute for Public Safety, because then they offered like the combination where you can look from theory into practice, and that's something that I highly encourage to do in these fields, combining theory and practice. So after this introduction, it's time to create a common understanding, and I have highlighted some key theoretical concepts that I would first like to discuss with you. The first one is in the top corner. There is disaster risk management. This is what I see the context where my research takes place in, and it's important, like to define that context so that you have a better understanding, and also can link it to what I've also put in the slide: wargaming. Like preparing for and responding to disasters, and whether it are exercises or real disasters, can be seen as a part of the process of managing risks. So basically, risk in this context can be related to protecting something that we as humans value. And in order to deliver that protection, we need to deal with uncertainty, severity, and consequences. And these are three important building blocks of this concept. Like, for example, if you follow this logic, risk as a concept can be reduced by, for example, lowering the likelihood of a risk or the likelihood of an unwanted event by preventative measures, or you can manage the severity of the consequences by being prepared and respond to them. And you can prepare, for example, by exercises, and in the response, you can also provide feedback and so on. So this is exactly what basically emergency or disaster response organizations and systems are trying to achieve. But at the same time, while doing these tasks or dealing with these elements of uncertainty or of severity and consequence, you need to deal with uncertainty. We don't know what a certain response will trigger or how things will go, and we can always look back and say it could be better. So basically, when you need to deal with evaluation, I think evaluation can play an important role. And that brings me to the concept of evaluation, where I can see evaluation in this context as a systematic assessment that determines the value or performance of an emergency response actor with respect to the intended purpose. And then, if you know what was the intended purpose, match that expectation between the actual outcomes in any given scenario. So basically, in short, evaluations can support determining whether an emergency response met expected performance criteria or could be further developed or improved. I mean, and this can be seen here. You see evaluation as a process which deals with certain aspects, but when we talk about evaluation, it's also an important element of that process is the end or the product of that process, and we also refer to that as an evaluation. So basically, if you combine process and product, you can see that evaluation as a whole is a means or a tool for measuring actual outcomes against expectations. And then the insights that are collected through the evaluation process can be shared through evaluation products. And basically those products and that process together, they help to reduce uncertainty, as it can provide evidence and measured information about the actual outcome and their effect on, in this case, the reduction of the likelihood and severity of consequences in a disaster. So if I'm talking about evaluation, I will just flip to the next slide, because then I'm talking about this process. It's I think a logical process, and it's a holistic process consisting of several phases. The first phase is, of course, starting up the evaluation, where you're going to do evaluation planning, you're going to make the evaluation design, and you're going to think why you need to evaluate. From there on, you move to the next stage, and basically that's the execution of the evaluation, where you're going to compile and collect data and you're going to actually go into the field or whatever you're doing, you're going to look at those things that you can see, that evidence that you want to grasp. And once you have that grasp that information, that first step, then it's part where you need to go into analyze it, and you're going to compare it against, for example, objectives at the initial start of the planning. What did we intended to do, and what did we need to achieve? And then we move to the next and more the final stages of an evaluation, which are, I think, a little bit undervalued. And that's the moment when the product needs to be delivered and there needs to be follow-up, because it's important that once you have that data collected, you have to analyze, you need to store it somewhere. And most of the time we use evaluation reports for that. But I think here we can think if that's the right way of doing it. Like, do we need to write a report? But that's something I will touch upon later on with my findings. And then, of course, the follow-up. One of the key things that I found in my research is that evaluations are one-time things. So basically, we see an event, whether it's an exercise or a crisis, as a case-by-case basis. So there is not too much being done on that meta level, where you're going to look at the broader scope, like how are things going, and are we actually learning from the things we do. So if I talk about evaluation, I just flip back to the other slide. Talking about evaluation is more or less comparing these actual outcomes against expectations. Now we have a little bit talked about evaluation. I said, like, for example, in wargaming, but that's my interpretation of it, is that if you have a wargame, there is a lot of similarities probably with exercises in a disaster risk management context. So I think wargaming as a game can simulate things, and you can actually train and prepare yourself. So there are a lot of commonalities in that, and there are some complexities in the things. And one of the elements that I think are important for all these concepts, whether it's the context that we're operating in of disaster risk management, or the subject that we're talking about, the concept of evaluation, a key element of success are evaluations. And for evaluations, are their use and users. Users, they determine whether an evaluation will make an impact and will be successful. And that's something we sometimes tend to forget. If the expectations and or needs from users are not met, I think even the best evaluation can be shelved and will be seen as a useless product and not have that impact that it should have. So it's important to involve these users and develop a well-constructed and well-managed evaluation process. And that process should help us in collecting these evidence-based feedback and determine the effectiveness of preparedness and response activities. So basically, that process that I've shown in the other slide, it determines on the use and users, and they should be heavily involved, and in particularly in the first stages. We are in a fortunate position, I think, that the real crises, they luckily do not happen every day, and therefore a simulation is an important part. And I think here is also that the link with wargaming. Simulating crises in exercises can help us to mirror reality, and by evaluating this, they can help us to provide insights in how things are going. So looking from that risk management perspective, that valuable information that we can collect from exercises can help us to reduce the uncertainty. And that's, of course, part of the preparedness program, but in turn, it can help us also to reduce the loss of lives and resources during real events. So basically, these are, I think, key concepts when talking about evaluation. You might have noticed that how I built this presentation is that I started with identifying the why question, and I now talked about the what question. And this is also in line with something that I highly like and which formed a basis for my research, which is design research or design science. And I would like to elaborate a little bit more on that because it's an important part where I think it can be used for evaluation as well. So How I see it is that evaluation, the disaster risk management context, the organizations that are operating in it, they do not naturally occur. They are created by us, by humans. So you can actually see them as artifacts. So for example, emergency response organizations can be seen as artificial, purposeful systems that are associated with bureaucratic structures and are driven to maximize efficiency and effectiveness. And basically, from a design perspective, you should go beyond the creation of new knowledge only about these artifacts. You should also aim to improve their usefulness. So basically, if you look at it from that perspective, it's important to see that design science, they focus on these artificial objects and see whether they meet certain goals. And here evaluation comes in. Basically, the purpose of design science is aiming to understand the design and evaluate the effective performance of the artifact. And then the purpose of it is problem solving with an intention of improving it. So these elements, I think, are very important. And if we just have a brief look at the slide that I've put up, you see in the middle, and this is related to information systems research, but I think it's also applicable to our area. Like in the middle, you see the processes which are talking about building and developing something. So we're creating an artifact. But once the artifact is created, it's part to evaluate it. So you need to look at it and you need to get information on how effective and efficient was it. And basically this information flows back into flows back into that building process in order to refine things, to change things, to make it better, to improve it. Of course, this is not done in isolation, and then you move to the left side of it. It's done in an environment where people, organizations, and technology are taking place. And basically, the environment defines the space in which the artifact needs to operate and it influence. So basically, the artifact needs to be relevant for its environment, and also the information or the task it produces needs to have a certain relevance. So that's the left side of this figure. On the other hand, there is also the more scientific side of it, which is here referred to as a knowledge base. And this provides the raw materials related to which the researchers accomplish. And here you find theories, methodologies, and all these frameworks, more the scientific part. And that's the rigor part of it. You want to be very rigorous and you want to provide information that's solid from a knowledge perspective. And then something interesting comes in, and that's something I mentioned also in the introductory text of this presentation. Here we get the rigor-relevance gap. From a scientific perspective, you want to be rigorous. You want to be very clear on how you use things, and you want to build even theories if you want to emerge a field. But if you're moving more to the practical side of it, there the relevance is becoming more and more important. And then basically you end up with a concept that's called the actionable knowledge concept. And that's something that's an emerging process. And the aim of actionable knowledge is to translate key findings and package them in a way that supports appropriate action. So basically, it's a translation process between scientific rigor and practical relevance. If you had a brief look at my thesis, I tried to do something similar in that, because if you look at all the figures that I use in my thesis, by only glancing at them, you will get an overview of my research. So that's trying to overcome that hurdle where you have, well, people are not all, the practitioners are not all interested in that scientific justification and everything, but by providing information in such a way, you can help them to not grasp at least the relevant information for them. So this is very, very interesting. And just to add a few questions when you're talking about that rigor relevance gap and what can help you to create relevant or actionable knowledge, is that you start by asking yourself the question when you evaluate. Also, this is also applicable to evaluation. Like, what do the users want? What do we want the users to do? So your audience, your target audience, if you deliver an evaluation for a specific purpose, what do we want these users to do after the evaluation? What do we want them to do with it? And the other question you can ask is, like, who do we want to take action? Like, who is our target audience? Who do we need to address? And then the next step is when you have these answers to these questions, you can ask yourself the question, like, how should the message be delivered so the audience is likely to act on the information? And finally, there's with what effect, of course, that's another question. And related, this also relates to the question, like, why did we evaluate this? Like, do we need to evaluate it? And when you yourself asking these questions when running an evaluation, you might also end up with the conclusion that even the evaluation report, which is a common way of delivering a product of an evaluation, is that the right tool if you want to overcome the rigor-relevance hurdle, and how can we do that? But this is something that we can talk upon at a later stage. So basically what I did is I gave you some background on the concepts of disaster risk management. I tried to relate it to wargaming. I also talked about evaluation, how I see it, and more the underlying background of design science in it. Before moving into some findings that we can talk about, is I want to give you a little bit an idea of how the crisis management in the Netherlands is arranged, just as a short sidestep of my talk. So basically what you see here on the left side is the Netherlands, which is divided currently in 25 safety regions. And these safety regions, they are responsible for improving disaster risk management and crisis management in the Netherlands. And they have responsibility in protecting the Dutch citizens. However, it should be emphasized, and that's why I wanted to give you also a little bit of impression about how we have how things are organized in the Netherlands, is that safety regions are not a response organization themselves. They bring together resources from other response organizations, so the traditional response organizations such as fire and rescue services, paramedics, and police, and they are mainly responsible for the execution and maintenance of the generic crisis management structure on a regional level, and that's related to that right figure that I've shown. In the Netherlands, the crisis management is built around 4 areas of vital interest. So we have the public safety, the national security, economic security, and international security. And basically, depending on which vital area of interest is threatened, a certain crisis management structure will be put in place. The safety regions, they are mainly part of that generic crisis management structure on the left side, so the green one, where you have the Minister of Security and Justice with the King's Commissioner and the mayors and related safety regions that are focusing on that public safety part. And they are in their role there. But on the other hand, for example, during another crisis, if we had like COVID and the pandemic crisis, then also functional areas will be put in place, like for example the Ministry of Health and specific people related to that. So this actually shows that in the Netherlands, although the concept of a safety region and the structure might be shown very clear, it also makes things complex, and it makes it even more complex if I'm going on a more regional level, where we also have various coordination levels. But this was just a brief sidestep, so you have a complex or an understanding of the complex system in the Netherlands when we talk about crisis management. So now we'll go back to my research, and we're going to try to combine some findings and relate them to wargaming. So what I did is I started by the first step of my research is just starting out to look out what's out there. If you're talking about disaster response evaluation, what's written in theory? Is there any theory? Is there any scientific literature on disaster response and disaster response exercises and its evaluation, of course? I performed a scoping study which helped me to provide a comprehensive overview of what's out there. And I must say I was very opportunistic and hoped to find a lot of things that I can build upon. But basically what I found is that there was a limited amount of literature on this topic available. So there is literature out there, but it's mostly in the medical domain. And that maybe has to deal with that evaluation is an important part of public health in the US. So a lot of publications are taking place in that public health medical area. What I found out is that there are various groups with various foci. So basically, when I analyzed these what's out there is that we have various groups focusing on specific aspects. So there is a group focusing on performance measurement. Another group is focusing on criteria. But in general, the literature that I found is descriptive. And although these 4 groups could be found, what I found is that theory, if you're talking from a theory and knowledge-based perspective, this literature is not building upon each other. So it is on an individual case-by-case basis. Basically, we describe an exercise and we discuss how we can evaluate. And of course, there are some examples where evaluation guides or frameworks are being presented, but then there is not a combination where you apply them in real practice. So basically what I found out is that there is little or no effectiveness of the methods being used. And that brought me to the second step of my research. Like if you don't find a lot of information in theory, you're going to look into practice. So I started looking in like how do we do things in the Netherlands when we're delivering evaluations? Are there common aspects that we find? Is there a common structure? And here I performed a document analysis. And the strange thing what I found there, if you look and you're going to combine theory and practice, is that it's basically similar situation. What you see there is that evaluations, either from exercises or crisis, they are done on a case-by-case basis, so on an individual basis. And this makes it difficult if you think about from a broader purpose of evaluation. If you want, for example, learn or develop your system or your tool, if you focus on one element, then there is less learning going on. So it's difficult to develop that body of knowledge that helps to create a basis for development and for your own building a kind of area. The other thing that I also found out is that there is a lack of detail regarding the reasoning behind evaluation designs. And I mean, this is more, if you remember that figure that I showed, it's more that rigor side of it. And that makes it difficult to assess the quality and the effectiveness of evaluation. If it's not clear, like how we arrive at conclusions or how data is gathered or how we reach a judgment, this makes it very difficult to say something about, okay, what's the quality of the product that I'm looking at. So basically, what I found out is that evaluation in a crisis or disaster or risk management context is a scattered field of evaluations that are unrelated, thus hampering their learning and broader development and not building upon each other. Another important aspect also, in evaluation, often the terminology lessons learned is used. From this perspective, it's actually highly questionable if lessons are actually learned and if we are not ending with the lessons identified. So evaluations as a one-time case, do they actually identify the lessons, or can we prove that the lessons that are written down are actually learned? But that's also something that we can discuss later on. One example if you talk about building up on each other is what I found out in the Netherlands. Is, for example, we had in 2016, 2017, we had a lot of power outages in various safety regions. And this is within one country, and they were sequential, so they were following up each other, and it was not within a few days, there were actually a few months between it. So you would actually expect that we exchange information from previous situations or scenarios, so that we can learn from, okay, we did this and how can we improve this. But this was limited at that time, so that makes it difficult to see whether you actually learn. Another part that brought up to me, if you're talking about or looking at all these evaluation reports at them, and then you see all that information presented, is this actually useful? And then these users come into play, like who determines that they are useful? That are the people that they are aimed at and that they should address. So that brings me to the next part of my research, where I went to do an experiment with these actual users of evaluation to see if the current evaluations are useful and how we can improve the usefulness, or what elements that are useful for them. So basically what I did is I did an experiment, and I created a concept which I call the evaluation description. Sorry. I will show it here on this slide. The evaluation description basically contains 4 parts. You see 5, but we'll talk about first 4. Its purpose. Like, why do we need to evaluate? Do we evaluate with the purpose of learning, or do we evaluate with the purpose of accountability? Then the next element of that concept is like, who or what is the focus of the evaluation? So what is the object under evaluation? Is it a person? Is it a tool? Is it something? Is it another artifact? Then, of course, that analysis part comes into play. Like, what happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen? And then finally, you need to reach a conclusion. And this is also referred to as a certain evaluation logic. I found them in the evaluation reports, but you will also find them in evaluation literature, that these are key aspects that influence the evaluation. And combined, I think they influence each other. So what I did is I constructed so-called vignettes, where I used the information coming from the real exercises that I did in the previous part. So I used real information and real text from that exercise, those exercise reports I used, and I gave it to these professionals, which were mayors in the Netherlands, but also operational leader and other operational personnel in crisis management, just to read through them and then ask them, like, okay, if you would get this information, and you need to learn from it, because that's one of the key purposes. If you want to learn from it, can you learn from it? And of course, I did some manipulations with the text in it, and started to find out that there is an interesting aspect. So I will move a little bit to the next slide and move back. But if you look at it, you see that if I talk about the purpose, then I started to ask these people, okay, if you want to learn from it, does it have? And at the same time, I did some manipulations with the object description. So I made it less clear, like, what is the object under evaluation, or I manipulated the analysis. So it was not clear, like, what happened and how did it happen, or how things were done. And then I also manipulated the conclusions, like, okay, is it clear, like, was it good or bad, or is it written in another way? And then it's interesting what I found out, I think, is that if people want to learn, so the purpose is learning, then the analysis becomes a very important part of the information we provide to the users. So basically, users, if they want to learn, you need to guide them basically to what happened to the scenario, so that they can build their own judgment based on the information they receive. The judgment then is important in a sense that from reading this analysis, they come to the same conclusion that the evaluator came, but they did it themselves, and that's part of the learning process. On the other hand, if I asked people, like, if you being held accountable, if you want, or hold others accountable, what elements are then, what needs to stand out then? And I found out that then the conclusions are more important and the analysis is less significant. So that's quite interesting when you think about delivering evaluation projects and where you need to focus on. This helps to structure who and what you're going to address. The other thing, what I still think and was not significant in my research, was the object description. Although I think it's a prerequisite, because you need to know what's under evaluation. But in some cases, these respondents were part of the description themselves. So maybe they had some prior information on that they were part of the evaluation. So I think this concept and these elements, they help to think about how we structure and increase usefulness of evaluations and thinking about it when we design them. I just go back, and because then the 5th element of this evaluation description comes into play, and that's the design. When we think about the purpose, the object, the analysis, and the conclusion, then the next step is to think about, okay, how are we going to design the product? What I previously said about actionable knowledge, how are we going to get the message across? How are we going to move into action? And what I found out is that, in at least the context that I looked, is that traditionally we use evaluation reports as the final product of that process that should reflect basically everything we did and everything we saw and collected. And then you can wonder if if you think about it, and what I talked earlier about design, science, actionable knowledge, is this the best product? And is an evaluation report a one size fits all project? And I think that's not the case. And we should think about how we can use other means of getting our message across. I think and then also that rigor relevance comes in. From a rigorous perspective, reports are a good way of sharing information, collecting information, structuring it. But from more relevance perspective, you can think about other means of communicating that message, and that's something that we should get across. I did test with these models, these were the outcomes, but on the other hand, also I started to ask these users like, okay, what do you actually expect from an evaluation? So if you would receive an evaluation without focusing on these elements when addressing that question, like what do you expect from an evaluation? And these are also help us to create and build some evaluation. So what you see here, and I will briefly go through it, is that surprisingly, the things that relate to expectations could also relate to that POAC concept, so that evaluation description. So basically, if I ask the respondents like, and just briefly and openly ask the question, what do you expect? You found, or I found that people are either referring to learning and development as a purpose for evaluation or accountability. So they want either held somewhat accountable or want to explain themselves to be held accountable. Another aspect then, if you talk about the object, so the O is that people look at various levels. So they expect sometimes information on the individual level, so how I can improve myself as an individual, but also in crisis management, there is a lot of team efforts going on. So you can also see that the team is often seen as an object. They want to know more about that as an object of evaluation. And then we have the systems perspective, the broader perspective. There are evaluations that try to address the three of them, but well, focused would be good if there is one of or two of these that are the object of the evaluation. And then of course the analysis, and that's an interesting part, because I mean, one thing is if you're looking more from a plan testing or normative perspective, people are referring to requirements, and I refer here the basic crisis management requirements, which is a kind of basis in the Netherlands. But the other part, what people expect from an analysis, is that they guide them through decisions that were made during the scenario. So what decisions were made and by whom were they made? But then the other combination will be the context in which these decisions were made and the dilemmas that were encountered. So what challenging effects were there, and where were dilemmas that influenced the decision making? And another part is just a timeline or a factual account of events that guides them through the analysis. So these are blocks that they expect from an analysis. An interesting part actually that I would like to highlight here is also in the analysis is evaluations are often taking place afterwards. So we have a lot of data available that might not be at hand when a decision was made. And then that's also that factual account of that sequential process of writing down analysis, is that people want to get like, how was this decision based upon? So where was it based on, and not in retro perspective? So make a distinction between, in retro perspective, we could have done differently, but given the information that was available at time X, that's this. So that's an important part when analyzing. And then finally, there is that conclusion part. And sometimes they want to hear recommendations, but sometimes also they want to have a verdict. And others say it would be nice if conclusions go beyond like the case or the scenario that we're in, but also look at it from a broader perspective. And the encompassing thing in this is also that they have some comments regarding the design. Like I previously said, we should think about how we present the data and the amount of data or information that we give to people. Like nowadays, a lot of information is available, and we should think about how we get our message across beyond the report. So this is basically what users expect from evaluations. If I look at from a broader perspective, and also from that uncertainty perspective, there is this model that I created where you can see two cycles. And basically, these cycles refer to the preparedness process that we have. We are preparing for an incident, or we're responding to an incident. And it comes all together in the center where I put the disaster response system. Here, these two cycles meet. That's the system that operates within it. There is, however, a distinction between these cycles. On the left loop, you see it's the exercise or the preparedness cycle, where you have much more control. You can control the scenario, you can control injects, and you have certain aspects that you can play with. For example, you can arrange the response capacity, you can plan for that, you can develop a scenario that is challenging, and you can check whether the injects or the effects meet the triggers that you want to see. So you can check whether you evaluate. So here, evaluation and exercise design are very closely related to each other, and need to influence each other. And basically, because it's controlled, you can also work collectively between exercise design and evaluation from the beginning. Like, what do we want to evaluate, and how are we going to put that forward within the exercise? So once that's done, and then you move to the completion of the loop, you're going to conduct that evaluation, and you're going to deliver an evaluation report, and you're going to do that in an actionable way. What's interesting is also from this model is that that's the formal evaluation process. And something that I forgot to mention in the beginning is I was talking about formal evaluations when I talked about that process and that structured and rigorous way. There are also informal evaluations going on, and that's the more difficult part of it. So basically, people attending exercises, we can do the formal evaluation regarding criteria and observe or cross question, but we cannot grasp everything what's happening inside people's minds, and they might change their behavior also. We are constantly evaluating ourselves. You are evaluating immediately also when I'm presenting and doing that evaluation yourself. And this is something which is difficult to make explicit, and we need to find tools for that. But both that formal evaluation and that informal evaluation has an impact on the disaster response system, and thus on how we respond to future disasters. But on the other hand, we have also that right loop, which is more the response loop, and is more uncertain because we cannot plan these real events. We might have an idea of what can happen, based on risk analysis and so on, but there is a lot of more uncertainty. And we need to, the evaluation there is maybe not from the beginning, but comes in at a later stage. So it is a different way of looking at things. On the other hand, the evaluation itself, I think, is still that informal and formal way and has some commonalities. But on the other hand, it's also good to highlight that is what I said previously, exercises and crises are not independent, they should be collective. So that's why that disaster response system, or that system in the middle, is very important, because here things are coming together. And if you talk about uncertainty, that preparedness loop that runs very quickly. We can do a lot of exercises. We can use exercises to test new procedures. We can use exercises to check how we are performing. It can be used as an experimental thing. So we can do a lot of things which can help us on that other cycle, the response cycle, to get more information beforehand. So to get insight, if we do A, then this leads to B or C. And also the response, it can help us predict certain things if we get that straight. So if we know how we are performing and we did some experiments, we can maybe better respond in the real life. On the other hand, this real response with the uncertainty can help us to test our exercises or our preparedness scenarios again. So there is an ongoing loops or cycles that are doing things. And then there's, of course, the aspect from evaluation perspective. If we deliver evaluation products, and now whether it's a report or whatever it is, if it's a tangible product, then it helps us. And then you see that middle line, it can be shared amongst other response systems. And that's something interesting that we should think of if we write evaluation from a target audience. Sometimes that audience are the safety regions or the individual or team it's about. But especially if we talk about these larger crisis situations like COVID, if we describe it in such a way, what I previously said regarding analysis, if we write it in such a way that people in Greece or Italy or maybe in Australia, if they read it, although it was taking place in a Dutch context, they can grasp their information where they can learn from. Like, okay, they did it like this and this and this. This led to this. This is similar to us, and then it becomes really interesting because then evaluation is not just something that's between, but it can help the involvement of the broader disaster risk management context. Although a disclaimer for this figure is all that it should be seen that this is not run in isolation. So there are various response systems, and also there are things that are influencing these evaluation and disaster response, like the political context. And that's something that a system needs to be adaptive and be able to change. And also here evaluation can help. So not only within the system, but also outside the system, evaluative data can help us. So having talked about some models, I think it is nice to move to the way forward, what I see coming from my research. And that's if you look at the research element, what I talked about is in the crisis management context, there is not much scientific literature about methods, which evaluation methods work or which approaches work. So it would be good if we look broader, and that I think that also would be applicable to for example, what are you doing in wargaming, but also in marketing and product management. Like, okay, what are methods that are being used, and are they being able to help us in achieving that evaluative purpose? And when do they work, and when should we use them, and when shouldn't we? So that's an interesting part that's open for further research. Another aspect that I found also within the Netherlands is that there is a lot of evaluation methods, they call it, are being used. And I wonder if you look at it from a more definition point of view, if it are really methods, and if it are not only data collection methods, and the analysis and the evaluative analysis is lacking. So I haven't found specific information or tests of evaluation methods like we have in social science with methods of thematic analysis, or with data collection methods like interviews and so on. Like, these are really like good and bad things. Like, when should you use it? How should you use it? When do they work, and when do they don't, or when don't they? And that's something that's really crucial, like from a methodological point of view, like, okay, the quality of our evaluations. Another part is also I showed that POACD approach, or that evaluation description that I mentioned. I did manipulations with these elements, but I think further research, and I hope I can do that in the future, is also you can focus on each of these elements. So if you're going to look, for example, at the analysis, even into detail, how you're going to present that information. I mean, I already identified the expectations of certain users, but okay, the next step would be implementing their expectations and needs, and see if that's really what they want. And that's something that needs to be further developed. Another aspect, and I mean, from a useful perspective, I think I got all the ingredients, but there is now the next challenge also to measure the impact of evaluation, and if we can make that part of that evaluation process, like I showed in the beginning, that slide of the process where you have to follow up. How can we actually follow the evaluative outcomes, if it achieves what it intends? So what was the impact of the evaluation? And it goes beyond usefulness, and it helps to identify areas that might increase the impact. And then an aspect also and I think that might be interesting for wargaming as well, if these individuals are taking place in these exercises or in simulations, how can we grasp the information that's inside the heads of people attending games or exercises? Like, there is a lot of information that we cannot see or whatever, but how can we at least support participants in making their individual lessons that are not so obvious, but maybe highly relevant for others to learn from? How can we make them explicit? And that would be a very interesting way to look at it. From a more practical perspective, I also see some challenges. And in particular, I talked about design research and that kind of thing. But it's important that there are some guidelines on evaluation frameworks or even standardization. Like I mentioned, it's an ongoing thing now with the group in Europe to standardize exercise evaluation. But what I found out is, for example, or not for example, but more important, if we want to perform meta evaluations, we should get a basis where we can build that meta analysis on, and that also requires some quality of evaluations underlying that, and how do we ensure that? And I think standardization is maybe the summum, but there might be other ways to get that process of the quality of evaluations that can be used, and making it possible to compare oranges to oranges, by talking about it and the guidelines. Another element that I also found out, and which is, I think, interesting to discuss, and that's also the evaluative part of it, is like, how good is good enough, and who determines that it's good? I mean, we have standards, we have laws, we have regulations, we have criteria, we have minimum requirements, etc. These are all written down, and they help us to check whether a criteria is met. But on the other hand, who determines that criterion? Who raises the bar? And an interesting question I always ask myself, like, okay, we can measure it against these standards, and that's one part of it. But also we can ask the participants, like, okay, when is, and we don't do that, and we can ask the users, like, okay, when is the exercise, the simulation, or the response successful? What are your criteria? Or we can also ask it the population. And that process of determining how good is good enough, and then do we always need to have the highest grade for it, or is there also some middleman? I mean, that's another thing. Evaluations have there's sometimes said evaluations are looking for those things that need to be improved, but on the other hand, evaluation can also help to determine if things are going good, and we should remain doing them. We continue the way we are doing it, and that's another element which we should keep in mind. So how good is good enough is a question that we can discuss together. And then, of course, that's the evaluation products. Like I said, we have the tendency to provide evaluation reports, but there are more means nowadays. I mean, we have the opportunity of using YouTube movies. We can make animations, infographics, etc. And it's good to talk to people in the communication area, like, okay, how can we get that message across, and build things on that. Then there is also that cyclic development, and that has to do with what I mentioned earlier, is that evaluation is only part of that specific simulation, specific case. We should think about it in a broader sense, because that's very important when you want to actually identify if lessons identified are being learned. You can't say that from a one-time only event. You need to check whether these changes that you made or the interventions that were done led to some kind of change, and whether that change is good or bad, that needs to be determined. So we need to look at it from a broader perspective, more holistic view. And then finally, something that I found out, if you talk about purposes, and that's something, and maybe it's a typical Dutch thing, I don't know, but evaluations sometimes also have that negative element, where people are talking about blaming, shaming, name dropping, and all kinds of, or scapegoating. And that's something that's really important, that as an evaluator or as an evaluation party, you should consider, because if you're doing an evaluation with the purpose of learning, you should be very clear about it and ensure that it is a learning thing. An example I have is that I know that an evaluation which was designed and created and written down for learning purposes, and people were very open in it, was used for accountability purposes, and that leads to trust issues with evaluations and gives it a negative view. So that's an important aspect. I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I think I'm also looking at the time, but that's good. I think if you look at it from a broader perspective, what I also would like to mention is something that we also should consider when designing evaluations is often the evaluator or the evaluation party is the party that gets the overview. So they are going away with the most knowledge. And that's something we need to think about, both as evaluators, but also as parties that are and users who are being evaluated. How do you ensure that information, that broad information, remains within my own organization? And that's something we can also discuss upon in a bit. So I hope that this presentation gave you a little bit of an impression about how the field of evaluation looks like, how my research came up with some ideas to structure evaluation products, and where elements are that can help us to improve evaluations. But I think also this is a continuous process. And like I showed in the end with some practical elements that we can do, but also research elements, I think both science and practice should collaborate in overcoming this hurdle of rigor and relevance. I think they're equally important in this process. And I hope that this work inspires future research in this area, because I know I'm enthusiastic about evaluation. I think it can be very valuable. There is a lot of things to gain. So I hope we can learn from the past and be better prepared for the next disaster by making evaluations more useful. And let's hope that the next disaster will be better dealt with, or we learn at least, and on whatever level we look at it. So with these words, I would like to thank David for asking me for this presentation. And I think now it's time to see how the things I talked about relate to your area of interest, because you are the users of my presentation. So I think I'm ready for the Q&A.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Ralf. That was really very interesting. And I think really, hopefully that the audience could recognize the relevance of this for wargamers, because two things that stood out for me in this presentation, just by way of kind of framing and setting up the Q&A, is the things that disaster risk management is studying is quite similar to wargaming, right? You mentioned uncertainty, severity, these kinds of things. This is very much the heart of a lot of wargaming designs as well. So I feel like there's a very similar analytic focus. The types of things we're looking at is quite similar, even if the scenarios might be different. We're looking for the same sorts of things inside the scenarios: uncertainty, risk, danger, and severity. And I think the other side I thought that was really familiar when you put up the slide was this tension between evaluation for knowledge production, so sort of facing towards a scholarly audience, and evaluation for business needs, which in the wargaming parlance would be sponsors, right? The people who are actually commissioning the games or requesting the commission of the game, and how they're often looking for a very different thing in terms of evaluation. And we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, but before we get to them, I just wonder if I could ask one or two from Anna and I, but just one in particular to kind of frame the overall question, to maybe give a sense of kind of who cares. Is you mentioned that in the disaster risk management world, there's a lot of case-by-case evaluation. And so I just want to ask quickly, there's a number of questions, but I would just ask them to start off with, which is that wargaming also similar to this, and that, you know, when you read wargaming reporting, it's often case-by-case evaluation. It's very bespoke. What's the problem with that? Why do you think that's an issue that needs addressing? What's the downside risk of evaluating on a case-by-case scenario basis? What are we losing by doing that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's not bad to look at it a case-by-case basis, and maybe I framed it a little bit worse than it actually is. So in certain elements, it's good to look at a case-by-case basis, in particular for the participants of that case. It often has various roles to look at it. It can help them to reflect upon their actions. So really and that needs to be addressed to that case. But if we're talking about that broader learning perspective, if you can recall that loop model where you're going to exchange information and you're going to build a knowledge base, then of course it's more important that you're going to collect these individual evaluations and bring them together. I think it helps us, for example, if we have similar scenarios, it helps us to get some kind of predictive element out of it, because you can see whether the same thing is going wrong or good at the same time, and if you make changes, what their impact is. And you can do that from a one-time only situation. You need to have more. I mean, maybe that's my scientific perspective, but one case is too limited to say if you want to develop something or if you want to learn something, and if you rather want to test. I mean, in particularly if you want to learn, because how you can show that you've learned is by demonstrating it again and show that what you did previously has changed and moved along, so that you improve things. So there is that aspect.
Okay, great. And I still have one or two questions here. I'm going to get to the Q&A for sure, because I'm not trying to monopolize, but I think these all lead in a kind of in a reasonably stacked way, which gets to then, you know, this argument here about kind of knowledge accumulation, right? If we're not all speaking the same language, we can't all really understand what we're saying to one another. And you mentioned there's a shift towards standardizing language. Can you kind of give us your thoughts about what the trade-offs are in standardization, right? Because some people see it as a way to generate transparency and rigor, but the critics would say the downside here is you essentially kind of block off or cut out certain interpretations or ways of thinking of things. So I'd just be curious to know what your thoughts are on this kind of debate.
Yeah, but I understand that debate, and I also I mean, a good thing of standardization is that it lays a bar for minimum requirements to some kind of quality level, so that helps. On the other hand, it depends also how you view standardization on things. We can limit it ourselves. I mean, standardization doesn't mean that we need to say you need to look at these and these elements, but you be very specific. So you need to look at coordination, for example. That's part of the standard. But you can say you need to look at processes that guide, and so the broader abstract level, so that you give at least some liberty within that specific focus that you want to have within an evaluation, and the standardization should help with that. I was also thinking about your previous question about this, and I want to combine that a little bit in something else that I think we can learn from, and that is actually medicine. I mean, I think wargaming and also crisis and disaster management, they're relatively new areas of interest, of research, new areas. Let's put it just broadly. Medicine is already a long time around, and basically they have, like, for example, if you go to a doctor, they have a plan. They know, because they have a certain cure actually, and that cure is based on the information they have. We know how the human body works. We know how the human body responds to certain medicine, to certain treatments. We know if we do this and this leads to either the patient lives or he dies. I mean, and that's not information and things that came overnight. I mean, that's centuries of testing, experimenting, looking at things, and we are only at the beginning phases. But I mean, in an ideal world, and also that has to do with that one-time only thing, and looking more at a meta level, creating a knowledge base, actually documenting this information, what works, what not, helps us to make our cure in crisis management, to have like kind of prescription that at least we have some kind of direction. If you do A, that leads to something in the direction of B. And that, I think, here the process helps, and standardization helps us also in that quality assurance. I mean, that's one thing we need to be very clear about, and that especially if you talk about observations, often evaluations use observations, in particular in field exercises, then you use observers to collect data. If you don't have a clear guidance or guideline on how to perform the evaluation and what is expected and what criteria need to be observed, then in particular these conclusions will be very blurred, because if it's the observer doing that analysis and providing his judgment based on his context, or he's doing that on more objectively following a procedure and process. And that's I think we need to have those elements in standardization. And that doesn't mean that we have to prescribe the observer how he needs to observe, but at least we need to ensure that the observations are done in such a way that it's transparent and leads to a qualitative result.
So kind of standardization of process rather than standardization of language or actual kind of the kinds of data you're capturing.
Yeah. And you see that also in that project that we're currently working on with the standardization. It's more process standardization than specific elements.
Okay, very interesting. Well, let me turn over to one or two of the questions that we have here in the Q&A. One here from Marco is about the types of data that's being evaluated, and he's asking, what about the evaluation of the crisis management staff themselves, that is their performance and their psychology in exercises and events? Is that something that's actually analyzed or evaluated?
Sorry, can you just...
So it's what about the evaluation of the crisis management staff, specifically their performance and their psychology in exercises and in events? So is this something that's done, and what, how is this evaluated?
In crisis management, I think this is an area that needs more attention. That psychological point of view. I mean, often what you see in crisis management evaluations focus on these procedures, on these structures, on teams, but not on that lower level on the psychological side of it. I think that's also very difficult in the things that we are currently using in crisis management, like the field exercises, the discussion-based exercises. I think that requires also a new way of thinking, and that all has to do with what I said. And what's the purpose of doing evaluation or doing exercise? And in particular, it's interesting if you want to see how people are mentally fit or whatever, and that requires a different type of evaluation than currently are being applied. But I think there are methods for it. But then I think, and that also has to do with that cross-discipline transfer. I think we should work closely with people in that area and see how we can transfer that better through our field. So there is an area for improvement in the broadening or the focus of evaluations. And I mean, also I know that it's a very tricky area in the sense that it, of course, procedures are very safe, but if you're going to more the psychological side of things or on the mental side of people in these operations, it becomes more personal and so on. So that might also have influence. If that's the question was aiming for.
Yeah, no, I hope we can accurately capture it there. Yeah, but I think that's what the question is aiming at. And I do take your point. I think it just generates it certainly generate a lot more burdens in terms of overcoming research design problems and also ethical questions about the kinds of questions you can ask people.
Yeah, and at the same time, it also requires maybe. I mean, that brings me to another thing where you can think about is who are these evaluators, and maybe for this type of evaluation, you might have a person with specific skill set with a maybe psychological background and so on. So that makes it also something that we need to think about. And I haven't mentioned it in my talk, but I think also, and it is not applicable to all situations, but in particular, these specific situations, you might need to have somebody with some more knowledge about, for example, crisis management or the system or design or whatever, but also about the human behavior, because it also comes to the making or breaking of some person. Basically, you don't want to force that. Actually, at least I think that should not be the case with evaluation. That's the thing with the blaming and scapegoating that we should avoid. So that requires also some sensitivity and other aspects.
Yeah, no, I think I know. Because also I think one of the interesting points, and this is probably similar with disaster management, with wargaming as well, is that there's often a lot of different types of things you might need to be expert in for be able to evaluate a particular game, right? So it's not just being able to understand it from a design side or the some generic evaluation side. You have a general problem of the types of synthetic data that's being generated is highly tied to expertise and interpretation. So it generates a kind of secondary burden that wouldn't be there if you're like doing statistical analysis, for example.
And that's something that you can take into account when from a broader perspective, as an evaluator or a lead evaluator, you can take it into account. But certain aspects, and depends on what you want to evaluate, what your object is and your focus. Right. Because then you might need those technical specialists, I would call them, because they know what's happening. For example, we are now talking about laboratories and how they need to be evaluated when using all these toxins and antigens and all those kinds of things. Yeah, I don't know anything about it, but probably a chemist, they know better. So you're going to ensure as a responsible person for the evaluation that you use the person's fit for the job.
Okay, very interesting. There's an interesting question here from John Curry about the kind of classic problem between the difference between the researcher and the thing being researched. He says, one of the problems I have found is game designers want long games, but to get actual decision makers to attend games, you need short games. So how do you decide the length of a game or exercise? I mean, how do you cut this intellectual Gordian knot?
Interesting thing, because it's something that and this is related to the exercise design, but it's something similar that I found out in my research when I did the experiments with the text. The texts were only 500 words long, and then people started to be a little bit like, it's a lengthy text. And that's also related to, for example, these evaluation reports. And and what you talk about, the design aspect, that's very interesting. Maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic in this, but I think that's the combination where you need to, between user and producer, you need to talk to each other. Because as a producer, and that's what I hear in the question, is you have an understanding that these people that are taking part of in the users or the respondents have limited time. But at the same time, you as a producer, if you can convince them that there is, I mean, that's the other thing with the how good is good enough question, and that applies here. How lengthy is lengthy enough? But maybe you can convince and find a way that, I mean, as a designer, you want to have the best, and as a user, you want to have limited time. But maybe you convince, as a designer, convince the user that it should be a little bit longer because these and these reasons, that you can do more and more, and that you can show different aspects that you want to test in the game. And then there might be some compromise, but maybe that's the Dutch way of foldering, that you're going to find the middle way in it. But I think that's still, and at least if you talk about people, if I take an evaluation assignment and I'm going to talk through them, okay, what's your purpose? What do you want to achieve? That if you talk about them, there will be some way of understanding that, okay, I understand that I don't have 15 minutes and I need maybe 3 hours for this. But it's all in the part of involving the user, and I think that's a crucial aspect. So just taking these people in and explaining them why it's useful to do these 3 hours. On the other hand, I think there will also be the psychological part. Will 3 hours be not a time span that your mind can work? So maybe you have some breaks in it, but there are I think that it's the combination and the discussion that you should open, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. That's maybe something else as a scientist, but also maybe as a designer or a product developer. We shouldn't be afraid of our customers. They and maybe it's an easy way of talking, but if you approach them in the right way, if you involve them in a good way and explain to them why certain decisions are made and certain criteria, there will be some kind of mutual understanding.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting point, and I think it really gets to the point that I brought up earlier, where the similarity is in the domain you're working in and wargaming, which is it's this practice that really is situated between a sort of a kind of a client-based world where there's an outside actor demanding the product, but it also has a kind of a intellectual responsibility to be able to produce results that can be defensible intellectually to a kind of scholarly audience. And it's a tension, I think, that, you know, it's not necessarily that common for other types of research, where you're kind of typically facing in one direction most of the time, and it makes it a little bit easier to know when you're doing it right or wrong. And this kind of thing about, you know, to kind of use John's phrase, designers want longer games because they know that they can capture more stuff if it's longer, but that's maybe not what the sponsor wants, and so you're slightly stuck in this trap.
But at the same time, as a designer or as a researcher, you're responsible for the quality. Yeah, and I mean then and on the other end, and that's something in my research that I found out, the users rely on that quality. They trust me as an evaluator or you as a designer or whatever role you play. The people have trust in that you are delivering a qualitative, your role from a good quality, and you should be responsible and take your responsibility for that. And that's very important.
I think this gets to the point as well that we talk about transparency, right? Because I think what you can do in a situation like this is you can say, well, I can give you a shorter game and say up front, it's going to be of a reduced quality. And then it's kind of buyer beware, right? And that way you're fulfilling that kind of responsibility to say, this could have been more sort of rigorous or analytically fruitful. It wasn't possible. Therefore, you know, all these results are maybe not as robust as we would like them to be, you know, and then maybe that would give an impetus for the sponsor to say, well, you know, I want it to be better than that. It's like, well, then you'll need to be here longer for us to do a better version. You know, there's no way around it.
And I know it's difficult. I mean, I've been in that position myself as well. If you take an assignment for an evaluation and then you get like the debate about the money thing is always a discussion. But then at least you should be transparent. I totally agree about it, and just say, okay, if this is what you want, we do it in this, but please be aware that we need to reduce things, or there will be bills. But we need to be clear about that. And sometimes it hurts. I mean, from a research perspective, you see a huge opportunity in either, for your case, a gaming situation, or in an exercise situation. But yeah, there is not more capacity or money or whatever funds are available. So we will always need to deal with limitations.
And to that point, so I have two questions. One is very short, and I'll say it now so you can think on it a little bit, and then I'll ask the other question. This one's a very simple one, but it's something you mentioned about interdisciplinarity and looking outwards to find more stuff. And I'd be curious to know, so you don't have to rush to give this answer, but I'd be curious to know what other sort of either academic or non-academic domains you've looked at to try to get some sort of sense of best practices in evaluation. I know you mentioned in the business world and so on, how they're doing these kinds of things. And I think that would be very useful because every discipline is always stovepiped and finds it very hard to understand what anyone's doing, even, down the department hall, never mind across a disciplinary line. So I'll let you reflect on that. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, which again is an evaluative question and something you put in your presentation about the types of things you can evaluate. And I've got my note here. Let's see if I can find it correctly before I phrase this, because you have evaluations of preparedness and evaluations of events themselves. And you showed that slide where the two things are kind of very similar, but they're not quite the same. One of the things that's sometimes discussed in the wargaming community is that the kind of best evaluative metric of a game was down the road when the event at which it simulated took place, did that game map well, right? To me, that's an example of kind of value, preparedness versus event. Do you find that is that the way that disaster risk management does one of its evaluations? They evaluate their preparedness against the actual event down the road and then see, did they match well? And if so, what's the danger here of comparing like this? Because you're comparing synthetic data, which is much more strictly modeled in the first version, with the much messier data that the real world generates. Or is that something that happens at all? Or are these actually more separate than they think? I saw that slide. It made me think of this discussion we see in the wargaming world about, let's see what happens in reality. And that will be the ultimate test of the game. I'd just be curious to know your thoughts about that.
I mean, the model is a model, and so it's an ideal situation. So I don't know if the link between preparedness and response, or in real events versus simulations, is that strong. We often have the tendency to say we exercise with the last real scenario in mind, so we're doing it backwards. Basically, we use the scenario data to check whether we could do it now. I mean, that's the more common approach within I think, the disaster risk management context. But exceptions will be there anyway. But yeah, it's difficult. Of course, you have a simulated environment and that real messy environment. But I think they're both useful in the sense that of course they will not match completely. But what I said earlier about that medicine kind of perspective, if you can practice, if you can learn, if you can identify, for example, trends, and you see how something is going, that will help you to see at least these elements in real life. So there can be a stronger link between that, although it's simulated. And you often, often heard things is also, and I experienced it myself, flood scenarios are always exercised with sunny weather and no rain and no high waters. But I mean, then you can question, is it always, in some cases it's necessary to have a realistic surrounding. So, but for certain elements, it depends also what's your focus of the evaluation and what you want to train or you want to achieve with your game. Is it the scenario that's relevant, or is it the performance that is triggered, and whether the performance is triggered due to a flood or due to a highly stressful situation where a lot of information needs to be dealt with. I mean, there are some similarities, and that's also something that we should keep in mind. And I think that also applies to war games and in crisis management. There are always things that are also part of our regular lives that we do. We don't always go beyond the extraordinary. We are not the Avengers. Sorry if I now make some crisis management mad, but still we're still humans, and it's part of our human behavior, and we should stay close to that and not always look for those exceptions. So yeah, there's not always a need to have that level of realism.
Yeah. Okay.
But I
okay.
understand critics will mention it. It's also an easy way of talking about it. Yeah. Sorry.
Wonderful. And so just the last question, which I already gave to you, is where would you recommend for the people who are watching this presentation, you know, if they're kind of interested in some other literatures for evaluation when they're trying to figure out how to do this for wargaming, what were some of the literatures outside of your discipline that you found fruitful, or even inside your discipline that you found fruitful to study?
Well, thinking about it, it also depends on what's the purpose of evaluation. So the why do you want to evaluate and the what you want to evaluate. I mean, that's something that's the first questions that you need to think of. What I found that has limited attention in our world or in our field is the user perception or the user satisfaction. Let's put it that way. And I think we can learn a lot from marketing in that. I mean, I don't know how it is in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, but maybe the Netherlands is maybe a bit over-evaluated. That if you go to the theater afterwards, you will get an emailing and ask like, how did you find the guidance? How was the seating? How was, you know, we want to know all these things. And that's really aimed at customer satisfaction. And I think that's something we could learn from. I mean, there is, of course, you need to think about why you need that information, and you shouldn't be over-evaluative because you need to be also that you don't stress the people in providing information. But that's I think an interesting area and discipline that we could learn from. Okay, like what we do with games and also what we do with crisis management is ask the people and also in crisis management, not only the responders, so the first responders, but also the citizens that were confronted with the disaster. I mean, there are a few regions now that are setting up those experiments now with asking actually the citizens if the safety region or the response organization acted in a good way according to their perception. And then I think marketing would be a very interesting area to look at. Okay. If you look at things more from a program point of view, also management literature has some kind of evaluation strategies in it, and also political science on more the policy effects of policy evaluation. So then you're more on these plan testing kind of things with hard criteria, measuring benchmarks and those kind of things. That's more in those areas. So that's where we can look at certain approaches to evaluation.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the presentation, Ralf. I think it was really, very interesting and so similar to wargaming in so many ways. So it was really great to know you're wrestling with the same problems that we are. So that's encouraging that we're all in the same mess. But I really appreciated it, and I really hope that our attendees got the most out of it. So just thank you once again from the King's Wargaming Network for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much for having me. It was nice to talk to you all. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.